The morning sun painted golden streaks across the cobblestones of Westminster as 20-year-old. Jake Mitchell adjusted his tour guide badge and checked his watch. Today marked his third year leading tourists through London's most famous landmarks, and he had developed quite a reputation among the tour companies. Jake possessed an infectious energy that could turn even the most boring historical facts into entertaining stories that had visitors laughing and taking photos. His secret weapon was his ability to read crowds and give them exactly what they wanted. American tourists loved his exaggerated British accent impressions. Japanese visitors appreciated his respectful bows and careful explanations. German tourists responded well to his precise timing and detailed information. But regardless of nationality, everyone seemed to enjoy his playful approach to the serious business of sightseeing. Jake had always been the entertainer in any group. During school, teachers would find him making faces behind their backs, causing entire classrooms to erupt in giggles. At university, he was the one organizing pranks and comedy nights. Even now, his friends expected him to be the source of laughter at every gathering. This constant need to perform had become so ingrained in his personality that he rarely stopped to consider whether his humor was appropriate for every situation. On this particular Thursday morning, Jake was leading a group of 15 tourists from various countries. There was an elderly couple from Australia celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, a family with teenagers from Canada to college friends backpacking through Europe, and several solo travelers with expensive cameras hanging around their necks. They had already visited the London Eye and Westminster Abbey, and now they were approaching the highlight of many tourists' London experience, Buckingham Palace. As they walked along the Mall, Jake entertained his group with stories about royal scandals, funny incidents involving previous monarchs, and amusing anecdotes about palace protocol. His audience was eating it up, laughing at his jokes and asking for more stories. The positive feedback fueled Jake's confidence, and he began planning something special for when they reached the palace gates. The area around Buckingham Palace was busier than usual. Street performers juggled fire sticks while tourists tossed coins into their hats. Vendors sold postcards and miniature Union Jack flags. Children pressed their faces against the palace gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. The atmosphere was festive and lighthearted, which made Jake feel even more justified in his plans to create some memorable entertainment. Standing perfectly still at his post was one of the Queen's guards, resplendent in his traditional red tunic and towering bearskin hat. The guard's name was Thomas Harrison, though none of the tourists knew this. Thomas was 26 years old and had been serving in various military capacities for 8 years. His path to becoming one of the Queen's guards had been neither easy nor quick. Thomas had joined the army straight out of school, driven by a family tradition of military service that stretched back for generations. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and his older brother was currently deployed overseas. For the Harrison family, military service wasn't just a job. It was a calling that connected them to something larger than themselves. During his military career, Thomas had completed 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He had seen things that changed him permanently, experienced losses that still haunted his dreams, and made decisions that would weigh on his conscience forever. The transition from active combat duty to ceremonial guard duty had been both a relief and a challenge. The relief came from no longer facing life-threatening situations daily. The challenge came from learning to channel his military training into a completely different type of service. The role of a Queen's Guard required a unique combination of military discipline, physical endurance, and mental fortitude. Guards were expected to remain motionless for hours at a time, regardless of weather conditions, tourist behavior, or personal discomfort. They were trained to ignore provocations, distractions, and attempts to break their concentration. It wasn't just pageantry. It was a demonstration of the highest levels of professional military conduct. Thomas took his ceremonial duties as seriously as he had taken his combat assignments. Every morning when he put on his uniform, he thought about the history it represented and the trust placed in him to uphold centuries of tradition. The red tunic wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol of dedication that thousands of soldiers before him had worn with pride. As Jake's tour group approached the palace gates, Thomas could hear the guide's voice growing louder and more animated. He had developed the ability to listen to conversations around him while maintaining his stoic expression and rigid posture. Most tour guides were respectful, sharing historical information and encouraging their groups to appreciate the significance of the ceremony they were witnessing. However, Thomas could sense that this particular guide was different. There was something in his tone, certain irreverence that suggested he might be planning something beyond the usual respectful observation. Thomas had dealt with various types of disruptions during his time on guard duty. Children would sometimes try to make him smile by making funny faces. Teenagers would pose for photos next to him. Occasionally, someone would attempt to touch his uniform or weapon. But Thomas could feel that this situation was developing into something more challenging than the typical tourist interaction. The guide's voice was becoming more theatrical, and the crowd around him was growing larger. Other tourists were stopping to see what was happening, creating the kind of audience that often encouraged people to take their behavior to extremes. Jake looked at the motionless guard and saw what he believed was the perfect opportunity to give his tour group an unforgettable experience. He had no idea that he was about to encounter someone whose life experiences had given him perspectives that Jake had never even imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both men in ways neither of them could have predicted. Jake's eyes lit up with mischievous excitement as he spotted what he considered the perfect finale for his palace tour. The guard stood like a statue, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the gathering crowd. To Jake, this presented an irresistible challenge and an opportunity to demonstrate his entertaining skills to an increasingly enthusiastic audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake announced in his most theatrical voice, "you are now witnessing one of London's most fascinating phenomena. These guards are trained to be completely unresponsive to any external stimulation. They're like living statues, immune to everything happening around them." He gestured dramatically toward Thomas, who maintained his rigid posture despite being fully aware of the attention now focused on him. Jake's tour group chuckled appreciatively, and several other nearby tourists began to gather, sensing that something entertaining was about to happen. The growing audience only served to fuel Jake's confidence. He thrived on attention, and the larger the crowd, the more elaborate his performances tended to become. He had performed similar routines at other locations around London, always to positive reactions and generous tips. "Watch this," Jake continued, stepping closer to the guard. "I'm going to demonstrate just how professional these soldiers are. Nothing I do will break their concentration." He began with subtle movements, waving his hands near Thomas's face and making exaggerated facial expressions. The tourists laughed and began pulling out their phones and cameras, eager to capture what they assumed would be harmless fun. Thomas felt his jaw tighten slightly, but his training kicked in automatically. He had been taught to ignore distractions and maintain his composure regardless of external circumstances. However, something about this particular situation felt different from the usual tourist antics. There was a quality to the guides, behavior that suggested a lack of understanding about what the uniform represented and what the role truly meant. Encouraged by the laughter and the growing crowd, Jake decided to escalate his performance. He began mimicking the guard's posture, standing rigidly beside him with an exaggerated military bearing. "Look at me," he called out to his audience. "I'm a royal guard too." The crowd's laughter grew louder, and more people stopped to watch the developing spectacle. Jake's mimicry became increasingly elaborate. He imitated what he imagined was the guard's thought process, speaking in a robotic monotone. "I am a robot. I do not think. I do not feel. I just stand here looking important." While tourists take pictures, the crowd's reaction was mixed now. Some people laughing, while others began to look uncomfortable with the direction the performance was taking. One of the Canadian teenagers in Jake's original group tugged on her father's sleeve. "I don't think this is very nice," she whispered. Her father nodded, also beginning to sense that the situation was crossing lines of basic respect. However, Jake was too caught up in his performance to notice the shifting mood among some of his audience members. Thomas remained perfectly still. But internally, he was struggling with emotions that his military training had taught him to control. The guide's words cut deeper than simple mockery. The suggestion that he didn't think or feel, that his service was merely for show, touched on fears and insecurities that Thomas carried from his transition out of active combat duty during his time in Afghanistan. Thomas had been valued for his quick thinking, his ability to make life and death decisions under pressure, and his skill in protecting his fellow soldiers. The ceremonial aspect of his current role sometimes made him question whether his service still had the same meaning and importance. Jake's mocking words unknowingly echoed Thomas's own internal struggles about the value of his current position. "I bet he doesn't even know where he is," Jake continued, his voice growing louder as he fed off the crowd's energy. "Maybe he's thinking about what he's going to have for lunch, or wondering when he can go home and take off this costume." The word costume hit Thomas particularly hard. This wasn't a costume to him. It was a uniform that represented a proud tradition of service and sacrifice. Jake then began to comment on specific aspects of the guard's appearance. "Look at this funny hat," he said, gesturing toward the bearskin. "It's so big and ridiculous. I wonder if there's actually a person under there, or if it's just a very elaborate scarecrow designed to impress tourists." Several people in the crowd began to look genuinely uncomfortable now, with some starting to move away from the group. An elderly British gentleman, who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward slightly, as if he wanted to intervene, but then hesitated. He had served in the military himself many decades earlier and understood the discipline and dedication required for such a role. The mockery he was witnessing clearly disturbed him, but he wasn't sure how to address the situation without creating an even bigger scene. Thomas could feel the weight of the growing crowd's attention, could hear the cameras clicking and phones recording, and could sense the mixed reactions his situation was generating. Some people were still laughing, but others were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. The conflict between his duty to remain motionless and his desire to address the disrespectful behavior created an internal tension that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Jake, oblivious to the changing atmosphere around him, prepared for what he intended to be his grand finale. He had noticed that some tour guides would lightly tap the guards' boots or make as if to touch their uniforms while explaining that touching was not allowed. Jake decided to take this a step further, reaching out dramatically as if he was going to touch the guard's face, stopping just inches away. "I wonder if he's even real," Jake announced loudly. "Maybe if I touch him, he'll prove he's actually human and not just a very convincing wax figure." The suggestion drew gasps from several people in the crowd, and the elderly British gentleman finally found his voice. "That's quite enough, young man," the older man said firmly. "Show some respect." His words carried the authority of someone who had served and understood the significance of what they were witnessing. However, Jake was too caught up in his performance to pay attention to the criticism. The moment had arrived when Thomas would have to make a decision that would change everything. The moment came like a thunderclap in clear skies. Thomas turned his head slowly, deliberately, until his eyes locked directly onto Jake's face. The movement was so controlled and precise that it seemed to happen in slow motion, creating a ripple effect through the crowd as people realized something significant was occurring. The laughter died instantly, replaced by an electric silence that made even the distant London traffic seem muted. Jake found himself staring into eyes that held depths he had never encountered before. These weren't the eyes of someone playing a role or going through motions. They belonged to a man who had seen humanity at its worst and its best, who had made impossible choices under unimaginable pressure, and who carried scars both visible and hidden. The intensity of that gaze stopped Jake's planned words in his throat and made him feel suddenly uncomfortably small. "Do you think this is funny?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible to everyone in the suddenly quiet crowd. The question wasn't delivered with anger or aggression, but with a quiet dignity that was somehow more powerful than any shout could have been. Jake opened his mouth to respond with another joke, but found that no words would come. Thomas continued, his gaze never wavering from Jake's face. "Do you see entertainment when you look at me? You see someone whose purpose is to amuse you and your friends?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Jake felt the first stirrings of genuine shame creeping into his consciousness. Around them, tourists were putting away their phones and cameras, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something far more serious than the light entertainment they had expected. "This uniform," Thomas said, his voice taking on a quality that seemed to reach something deep inside everyone listening, "represents every soldier who has ever stood guard over something greater than themselves. When I put it on each morning, I think about my friend Michael, who died in an explosion in Afghanistan when he was just 23 years old. He was going to be married when he came home. His fiancée still sends me letters on his birthday." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as the guard's words sank in. The crowd around them had grown completely silent, and he could see that many people were visibly moved by what they were hearing. An older woman had tears in her eyes. Even the teenagers who had been laughing moments before now looked ashamed and uncomfortable. Thomas's voice remained steady and controlled, but there was an underlying current of emotion that spoke of carefully managed grief and loss. "I think about Sarah, who lost her right arm to an improvised explosive device, but still volunteers at the Veterans Hospital every weekend, helping other wounded soldiers learn to adapt to their new lives. I think about David, who came home with invisible wounds that make it hard for him to sleep at night, but who still finds the strength to counsel other veterans dealing with similar struggles." The guard's words were creating a profound shift in the atmosphere around them. What had begun as a light-hearted tourist attraction was becoming something entirely different. A window into experiences and sacrifices that most of the gathered crowd had never considered. Jake found himself thinking about his own life, his own priorities, and feeling increasingly shallow and selfish by comparison. "Every day that I stand here," Thomas continued, "I carry their stories with me. I honor their sacrifice by performing my duty with the same dedication they showed in much more dangerous circumstances. This isn't a costume I wear for your entertainment. It's a memorial that I carry on my body, a reminder of people who gave everything they had for something they believed in." Jake tried to find words, tried to think of something to say that would somehow lighten the mood or return the situation to the comfortable realm of harmless fun. But nothing seemed appropriate anymore. The guard's quiet dignity and obvious sincerity had transformed the entire dynamic, leaving Jake feeling exposed and ashamed in a way he had never experienced before. "You asked if I was real," Thomas said, and now there was just the slightest edge to his voice. "I'm real. My grief is real. My dedication is real. The responsibility I feel toward the people who can't stand guard anymore is real. What you're doing right now, treating someone's service as a source of amusement, that's real too. And it says more about who you are than anything I could tell you about myself." The crowd had grown even larger now, but the quality of their attention had changed completely. People weren't watching for entertainment anymore. They were witnessing something profound and transformative. Many of them were clearly emotional, moved by the guard's words and ashamed of their own earlier participation in the mockery. Jake felt tears stinging his eyes, though he couldn't quite understand why. He had never been particularly emotional or sensitive, had always prided himself on his ability to laugh off criticism and keep things light. But something about the guard's words, about the quiet strength and dignity with which they were delivered, was breaking through defenses he didn't even know he had built. "I'm not angry with you," Thomas said, and somehow this made everything worse. Anger would be easier to dismiss, easier to laugh off later, but I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that someone would look at a symbol of service and sacrifice and see only something to mock. I'm disappointed that in a world where so many people have given everything, others think it's appropriate to treat what little honor remains as a source of entertainment. The words hit Jake like physical blows, each one landing with the force of absolute truth. He realized that everyone around him was watching, waiting to see how he would respond to this unexpected lesson in dignity and respect. For the first time in his adult life, Jake found himself completely without words, completely unable to find a way to make light of a serious situation. The silence stretched between them like a bridge Jake didn't know how to cross. Thomas maintained his steady gaze, and Jake could feel the weight of judgment from not just the guard, but from every person in the crowd who had witnessed his transformation, from entertainer to something much smaller and more shameful. The Australian couple from his tour group looked at him with obvious disappointment, while the Canadian family had quietly moved away. Clearly wanting to distance themselves from the situation, Thomas resumed speaking, his voice still controlled, but carrying an even deeper current of emotion. You want to know what standing guard really means? It means holding your position when your feet are swollen and bleeding inside your boots. It means maintaining your composure when people mock something you consider sacred. It means carrying the weight of other people's sacrifice while strangers treat you like a curiosity in a museum. Jake felt his face burning with shame as he began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. This wasn't just about a few jokes at someone's expense. It was about treating someone's deepest convictions and most meaningful service as entertainment. The guard's words were painting a picture of dedication and sacrifice that made Jake's own life seem trivial and self-centered by comparison. During my second tour in Afghanistan, Thomas continued, his voice taking on a more personal quality, we lost 3 men in my unit during a single week. 3 men who had families waiting for them at home, who had dreams and plans and people who loved them. At each of their memorial services, we stood at attention for hours, honoring their sacrifice with the same discipline they had shown in life. The crowd was completely captivated now, hanging on every word. Jake could see that several people were crying openly, moved by the guard's story and ashamed of their earlier participation in the mockery. Realized that Thomas was sharing something deeply personal, something that clearly caused him pain to discuss, and that this sharing was both a gift and a lesson. Standing here in this uniform is my way of continuing that memorial service, Thomas said. Every day I stand at attention for the people who can't stand anymore. Every day I maintain the discipline and honor they would have maintained if they had been given the chance to come home and serve in different ways. Jake wanted to disappear, to somehow undo the last 30 minutes and approach this entire situation with the respect it obviously deserved. But he also found himself genuinely curious about this man whose experiences were so far removed from his own comfortable, entertainment-focused existence. For the first time in his life, Jake was encountering someone whose purpose and dedication made his own pursuits seem shallow and meaningless. You perform for crowds, Thomas observed. And Jake realized the guard had been watching him long before the confrontation began. You seek laughter and applause and approval. It's not necessarily wrong, but when your entertainment comes at the expense of someone else's dignity, when your need for attention overshadows your capacity for respect, then you're taking something valuable from the world rather than adding to it. The words stung because they were so accurate. Jake had built his entire adult identity around his ability to entertain others, to be the source of laughter and good times. He had never seriously considered whether his entertainment might sometimes come at a cost to others, whether his jokes might sometimes cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. I don't perform, Thomas continued. I serve. There's a difference that goes deeper than the actions themselves. Performance is about getting something from others' attention, approval, admiration. Service is about giving something to others' protection, dedication, honor. When you confuse the two, when you treat someone else's service as your performance opportunity, you diminish both. Jake found his voice, though it came out smaller and less confident than he had ever heard it sound. I didn't know, he said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. I thought it was just a job, just something people did for the tourists. Thomas's expression softened slightly, but his gaze remained intense. Not knowing is understandable, he said, but not caring enough to consider what you didn't know. That's a choice. You saw a person in uniform and decided that their purpose was to serve your need for entertainment. You didn't pause to consider that they might have their own story, their own reasons, their own dignity that deserved respect. Conversation had drawn an even larger crowd now, people stopping their own sightseeing to listen to this unexpected lesson in respect and service. Jake could see tour groups from other companies pausing nearby, their guides clearly recognizing that something significant was happening and not wanting to interrupt. Every person you encounter has depths you can't see from the surface, Thomas said. They have experiences that shaped them, losses that changed them, purposes that drive them. When you treat someone as entertainment without considering their humanity, You're not just disrespecting them, you're limiting your own capacity to connect with the richness and complexity of other people's lives. Jake felt tears flowing freely. Now, no longer trying to hide his emotional response to the guard's words. Around him, he could see that many others were similarly moved. The elderly British gentleman who had earlier tried to intervene approached slowly and spoke quietly to Thomas. "Thank you, son," the older man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I served in the Royal Navy 40 years ago," she just said. "What you just did, that took more courage than anything I ever did in uniform. Thank you for defending not just your own dignity, but the dignity of everyone who has ever served." Thomas nodded slightly in acknowledgement, maintaining his professional composure while clearly being moved by the older veteran's words. Jake watched this exchange and realized that he was witnessing something he had never seen before. True mutual respect between people who understood sacrifice and service in ways he never had. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but not in the way Jake had expected. Instead of wandering off to continue their sightseeing, many people approached Thomas to offer quiet words of thanks and respect. Jake stood frozen, watching as person after person acknowledged the dignity and purpose he had been too blind to see. His original tour group had been taken over by another guide, leaving Jake alone with the consequences of his actions and a growing understanding of how profoundly he had misjudged the situation. A middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes stepped forward and spoke directly to Thomas. "My brother served in Iraq," she said softly. "He came home, but he was never the same. Thank you for honoring people like him, for remembering what service really means." Thomas nodded slightly, maintaining his formal posture, but clearly moved by her words. Jake watched these interactions with a growing sense of isolation and shame. He realized that there was an entire world of understanding and respect that he had been completely oblivious to. A network of connection between people who understood sacrifice and service that he had never been part of. For the first time in his life, his ability to entertain and amuse people seemed not just insufficient, but almost insulting in the face of such genuine depth. As the immediate crowd thinned, Jake found himself still standing near Thomas, unsure whether to leave or stay, but feeling that walking away would somehow make his behavior even worse. He had no experience with situations that couldn't be lightened with a joke or smoothed over with charm. The weight of genuine remorse was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. "I want to understand," Jake said finally, his voice barely audible. "I want to understand what I did wrong, not just know that I did something wrong. I want to understand why this matters so much, why your service is so important, that my jokes were so hurtful." Thomas remained silent for a long moment, and Jake wondered if he had missed his chance to learn something valuable. When the guard finally spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been throughout the confrontation, but still carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Understanding doesn't come from an explanation," Thomas said. "It comes from choosing to see beyond yourself, from recognizing that other people's experiences might be deeper and more meaningful than they appear on the surface. You can't understand what service means by having someone tell you about it. You can only understand it by choosing to serve something larger than your own immediate gratification." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully grasped what the guard was telling him. "How do I do that? How do I learn to see beyond myself?" The questions felt strange, coming from someone who had always focused primarily on his own entertainment and comfort, but they also felt necessary in a way that surprised him. "Start by asking different questions," Thomas replied. "Instead of asking, 'How can I use this situation for my own purposes?' ask, 'What is this person's story?' Instead of asking, 'How can I get attention?' ask, 'How can I show respect?' Instead of asking, 'How can I entertain myself and others?' ask, 'How can I contribute something valuable?'" The advice hit Jake like a revelation. He realized that almost every interaction he had with other people was filtered through his own needs and desires for attention and approval. He had never seriously considered approaching social situations with the primary goal of understanding or respecting others rather than entertaining them. "The uniform I wear," Thomas continued, "represents a commitment to put other people's needs and safety ahead of my own comfort and convenience. That's what service means at its core, choosing to prioritize something more important than yourself. It doesn't have to be military service. It can be teaching, caring for family members, volunteering in your community, or any number of other ways of contributing to something larger than your individual wants. Jake felt a profound shift occurring in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For 28 years, he had approached life as if it were primarily about his own enjoyment and entertainment. The guard's words were showing him a completely different way of thinking about purpose and meaning. "I've been selfish," Jake said, the admission feeling both painful and liberating. "I've been so focused on being entertaining and getting people to laugh that I never stopped to consider whether my entertainment might sometimes hurt people or whether there might be more important things to focus on." Thomas's expression softened further, and Jake could see something that might have been approval in his eyes. "Recognizing that is the first step toward changing it," the guard said. "Most people go their entire lives without ever seriously examining their motivations or considering whether their actions serve purposes larger than their immediate desires." A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, approached with his mother. The child looked up at Thomas with obvious admiration and spoke in a clear, respectful voice. "Thank you for protecting us," he said simply. His mother smiled proudly and nodded to the guard before leading her son away. Jake watched this interaction and felt something shift inside him. The simple respect and gratitude from the child highlighted just how shallow and inappropriate his earlier behavior had been. He began to understand that there were people in the world who genuinely deserved admiration and respect, and that his role should be to recognize and honor that rather than to mock it for entertainment. "I don't know how to fix what I've done," Jake said, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "I don't know how to make up for treating your service as entertainment, for disrespecting something that clearly means so much to you and to other people." Thomas was quiet for a moment before responding. "You don't fix it by trying to undo it," he said finally. "You fix it by learning from it, by letting this experience change how you approach other people and situations in the future. You fix it by choosing to be someone who adds respect and dignity to the world rather than someone who diminishes it for the sake of a few laughs." 9 months after that life-changing encounter at Buckingham Palace, Jake Mitchell stood in a completely different uniform and a completely different role. The bright yellow vest of a volunteer coordinator at the London Veteran Support Center wasn't as formal or traditional as Thomas's red tunic, but it represented a transformation that went far deeper than clothing. Jake was no longer the person who had approached that palace gate seeking entertainment at someone else's expense. The work wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't as immediately gratifying as making tourists laugh. Jake spent his days helping former military personnel navigate the complex process of adjusting to civilian life. He assisted with job applications, connected veterans with mental health resources, organized support groups, and helped coordinate practical services like housing, assistance, and medical care. Every day brought him face to face with people whose experiences made his own previous concerns seem trivial. During his first week at the center, Jake had met Robert, a former Royal Marine who had lost both legs to an improvised explosive device. In Afghanistan, instead of bitterness or self-pity, Robert displayed a determination and positivity that humbled Jake completely. "I can't do everything I used to do," Robert had said with a smile, "but I can still do more than most people think. The key is focusing on what you can contribute rather than what you've lost." That philosophy had become central to Jake's new understanding of purpose and meaning. He had spent years focusing on what he could get from other people after attention, approval, tips. Now he was learning to focus on what he could give: time, respect, genuine assistance, and most importantly, the kind of dignity that Thomas had shown him that day at the palace. Jake had tried repeatedly to return to Buckingham Palace to find Thomas and express his gratitude properly. But the guard rotations made it impossible to locate the man who had changed his life so profoundly. However, the impact of that brief encounter continued to shape every aspect of Jake's new existence. He carried Thomas's words with him daily, using them as a guide for how to interact with others and how to approach his work. The veterans Jake worked with taught him lessons every day about resilience, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. Maria, who had served as a military medic, now volunteered at homeless shelters, despite dealing with her own post-traumatic stress. Who had been a helicopter pilot, spent his weekends teaching disabled children how to navigate wheelchairs with confidence and joy. Sarah, who had lost her hearing to an explosion, had learned sign language and now interpreted 4 deaf veterans at medical appointments. Each of these individuals embodied the same quiet dignity and purposeful service that Thomas had demonstrated. They had all faced losses and challenges that would have broken many people, yet they chose to channel their experiences into helping others. Jake began to understand that true strength wasn't about entertaining people or avoiding difficulty. It was about finding ways to serve despite personal cost. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. For the first several months, Jake struggled with his new role. He missed the immediate gratification of making people laugh, missed being the center of attention, missed the simple pleasure of entertaining others without having to think deeply about complex social issues. There were days when he questioned whether he was really helping anyone or just trying to make himself feel better about his past behavior. But gradually, Jake began to experience a different kind of satisfaction. When he helped a veteran find stable housing, when he connected someone with the mental health support they needed, when he facilitated a support group meeting that allowed people to share their struggles and find community, he felt a sense of purpose that was deeper and more lasting than any laughter he had ever generated. Jake also began to understand the ripple effects of respect versus disrespect. Every person he treated with genuine dignity seemed to carry that treatment forward in their other interactions. Veterans who felt respected and supported at the center were more likely to engage positively with their families, more likely to seek additional help when they needed it, and more likely to become sources of support for other struggling veterans. On the anniversary of his encounter with Thomas, Jake organized a special event at the Veterans Center. He had arranged for various community members to come and simply say thank you to the veterans for their service. Local school children made cards, restaurants donated food, and dozens of civilians came to listen to veterans share their stories, not for entertainment, but out of genuine respect and gratitude. As Jake watched the event unfold, he thought about the guard who had taught him that some things in life are sacred, that respect must be earned through recognition rather than demanded, through authority, and that the deepest lessons often come from the people we least expect to teach us. The man he had been 9 months earlier couldn't have organized such an event, couldn't have understood its importance, couldn't have seen beyond his own need for attention to recognize the deeper needs of others. During the event, an elderly veteran named Frank approached Jake with tears in his eyes. 30 years ago, I came home from Vietnam to people spitting on me and calling me a baby killer, Frank said quietly. Today, children are thanking me for my service and asking to hear my stories. You've helped create something beautiful here, something that honors what we went through instead of judging us for it. Jake felt his own eyes filling with tears as he realized the profound impact that simple respect and recognition could have on people who had given so much and received so little acknowledgement in return. This was what Thomas had been trying to teach him that day at the palace, that every person carries stories and experiences that deserve honor rather than mockery, understanding rather than entertainment. Later that evening, as Jake was cleaning up after the event, he found a letter that had been left on his desk. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but as he read the contents, his heart began to race with recognition and gratitude. Mr. Mitchell, the letter began. I heard about your work at the Veterans Center and wanted you to know that your transformation has been noticed and appreciated. The guard you encountered at Buckingham Palace was my son, Thomas Harrison. Told me about your meeting and how it seemed to affect you deeply. I wanted you to know that Thomas speaks often about that day, not with anger or resentment, but with hope that his words might have planted seeds that would grow into something positive. Thomas is currently deployed overseas again, serving with a peacekeeping force, but he asked me to tell you that he is proud of the work you are doing and grateful that his difficult decision to break that protocol that day led to such meaningful change. He says that true service is contagious when one person chooses to serve with dignity and purpose. It inspires others to do the same. Thank you for proving that even the most difficult lessons can lead to the most beautiful transformations. Thomas would be honored to know that his words continue to guide your work with veterans who need exactly the kind of respect and support you are now providing. The letter was signed by Margaret Harrison and included a photograph of Thomas in his deployment uniform, standing with a group of local children in what appeared to be a refugee camp. Even in the photograph, Jake could see the same quiet dignity and purposeful strength that had so impressed him during their brief encounter. Jake carefully placed the letter in his desk drawer, next to a small collection of thank-you notes from veterans whose lives had been touched by the center's work. Each note represented someone who had been treated with the respect and dignity that Thomas had taught him to value. Each note was evidence that the lesson learned at the palace gates had grown into something larger and more meaningful than either man could have anticipated as he walked home that night. Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him from entertainer to servant, from someone who sought attention to someone who gave support. The transformation hadn't been easy, and there were still days when he struggled with his new understanding of purpose and meaning. But he knew with certainty that he would never again mistake someone else's dignity for his own entertainment. The last anyone had seen of Jake's former self was that day at Buckingham Palace. The person who walked away from that encounter had been fundamentally changed by an understanding that some things in life are sacred. That respect is a gift we give to honor the experiences and sacrifices of others, and that true fulfillment comes not from getting people to laugh at others, but from giving people reasons to believe in the goodness and dignity that still exists in the world. Years later, Jake would tell this story to new volunteers at the Veterans Center, not as entertainment, but as testimony to the power of unexpected teachers and transformative moments. He would always remember Thomas's eyes, the steady strength in his voice, and the profound gift of being shown a better way to live. In learning to honor others, Jake had finally learned to honor himself.